Hi everyone, Lily here with Shared Segments China. So given the seriousness of what I'm talking about today, I wrote out what I'm saying ahead of time. And so I just have notes right here that I'm gonna refer to because I want to be as accurate and specific as possible. And I just want to only talk to what I can personally support, like what I personally experienced. So today I want to talk about something I really wish I had understood better when I started searching for my birth family about a year ago. Just about like how to evaluate some safe and potentially unsafe resources. I went back and forth for a long time about whether or not I wanted to make this video. But after a lot of consideration and reflection, I don't believe I should have to silence my experience, and I think other adoptees deserve enough information to make informed decisions about who they trust with their DNA, their family information, and their search. Before I get into this, I want to be very clear about what I'm going to discuss and not going to discuss. I've heard other concerns from members of the community, but today I'm only going to talk about what has directly happened to me, things that were directly said to me, and things I have documentation for. I'm not even going to say who you should and shouldn't work with or search with. I'm just sharing my experience so people have, all the information so they can decide for themselves. So last year, while volunteering with DNA Connect and working directly with its founder and CEO, Brian Stuy, I was put in increasingly uncomfortable positions after Brian um, repeatedly made sexually inappropriate comments towards me. Brian asked about seeing me in the shower. When I confronted him about this comment, he apologized for saying it, but described it as, quote, a lizard brain thing. The lizard brain was a reference to a conversation we had on the phone about some of the stereotypical comments men can make towards women at times. And Brian used the term lizard brain as a way to describe this when men say some of these kind of like unprompted or unwelcome comments towards women. He then clarified that he had actually wanted to see me in that moment, but understood that he shouldn't have said it. He also repeatedly offered, without me asking or, bringing up any kind of context for this, to give me full body massages. He asked about my sexual orientation and whether or not I liked women, and at one point suggested that his wife could also give me a full body massage too. And this isn't me interpreting or just drawing conclusion from something like vague. These are things that like he actually like asked me and said to me. Um, yeah, and so I know when someone speaks publicly about an established person in a community, the conversation can quickly become about whether the other person speaking up is misunderstood or, what happened. So I'm not asking anyone to like blindly take my side. At the end, I'm going to show all the documentation that I have, and there will be a link to a Google Drive folder with a copy of that documentation. Just because I had to redact a lot of it because a lot of times we would talk about, things like DNA segments or DNA matches. So I didn't want to expose other people's, private information by posting about this situation. Um, so I think it's important to understand like, the context for everything. So this is kind of like a long timeline, but I just want to make sure I provide all the relevant context. I approached Brian because I am a Chinese adoptee and I'm searching for my, biological family. Um, when I started researching my DNA matches last year, I noticed that some of my kits were connected to matches managed by Brian Stuy through DNAConnect. I already knew his name vaguely. Brian and DNAConnect have been featured in, some articles I had seen online about Chinese adoptees who were searching for their birth families. And I saw that he had been doing this work for a while. So from my perspective, he was pretty established in the field and had, some experience that I could like learn from. So I reached out. Brian and I began emailing about DNA and search work. After only one or two calls, Brian gave me his personal cell phone number, and we started texting and speaking more regularly. And then over the next several months, we worked together on different DNA and marketing projects. And at some point, we were communicating several times a week and occasionally several times in a single day. Eventually, Brian invited me to Utah. The original purpose was for work. We had talked about doing different marketing campaigns for DNA Connect. So I was gonna, film a bunch of videos while I was there, so then we could post them throughout the course of like a whole entire year, so we could make the most of that time. Also examine DNA kits that he had. Possibly help create some family trees to see if we could identify additional connections for adoptees. Um, for example, if an adoptee had a confirmed second or third cousin level match, we could try to build that family tree, and see whether that could, lead us towards that person's biological family. I was really excited about this. I thought it was really cool that somebody was like taking my ideas seriously. And at that point in the search, like I said, in my head, he had all this experience. I'd seen he'd been on like documentaries, featured in news articles. It was just kind of like, okay, so he's kind of like the one to like go for all this stuff. Um, so Brian told me that DNA Connect could cover my flight. He also told me I could stay in his home with him and Lon and his daughter, so I wouldn't have to pay for a hotel. So at the time, like I thought this would be fine. Because whenever I originally like received the invitation, it seemed more of like a family thing. I knew Brian was the adoptive father of like three girls from China, so kind of like myself. They were about like the same age as me. And I understood like I'd be spending time not just like with Brian, but like with Lon and the girls, and we'd be doing work for the organization, which I knew that they were involved in too, periodically. So that kind of helped, fill the context for how I like examine the situation, whether or not, I would feel like safe going. But there were already things happening around the professional relationship, looking back, that I think people should pay attention to. For example, Brian asked me repeatedly to keep our collaboration quiet. His explanation was that other adoptees might feel jealous or left out because I was receiving what he described as special treatment. At first, I followed his lead. Like I said, I was new to the community. He was the person with all this experience and all these news articles and on TV and stuff. So I assumed he maybe understood like some kind of dynamics I didn't understand. But eventually, that secrecy put me in a position I wasn't comfortable with. Another person saw in the community saw one of my birth family search posts, and offered to purchase a search analysis for me, which Research China sells those. And because Brian had previously asked me to keep our collaboration quiet, I contacted him and asked him how he wanted me to respond to this person. His response was essentially to tell me that person to tell that person I had already gotten the report, even though I hadn't. So that would be a lie. In fact, he didn't even have the documents at that point that he said he would need in order to complete the analysis. And this really bothered me. I was no longer like asked to just keep something, like a collaboration, kind of like on the down low. Now I felt like I was in a position where I was supposed to misrepresent or lie, to somebody else in the community that I wasn't even, I didn't even know them, and I was supposed to lie to them. So that was one of the key reasons I ended up, ending our work together, in addition to the really inappropriate comments and then just like the persistence, like even so what I'm trying to say is the professional relationship felt like it was becoming more personal. So as the trip got closer, Brian suggested we divide the trip up between DNA Connect work and personal activities. And like I said, at first it seemed like a family-oriented trip, but then afterwards, things slowly started happening. Like all of a sudden, the trip started to be framed more in terms of like me and Brian and maybe Lon. The girls were no longer being mentioned. Um, he was saying things like offering the massages over and over, telling us that we could spend overnight together, share a hotel room, things like that. But again, like when I realized it was no longer the dynamic of like me going with like another family, it was me going with just like an older man I've never met before, it started to feel like uncomfortable. Uh, so like I said, the circumstances changed, so I decided rather than staying in their home, I would stay in a hotel, and I didn't want to do the like extra stuff that we talked about before, like maybe like going hiking or whatever. I just wanted to keep it like strictly work. And even after I told Brian that this was like a boundary I wanted to keep, he kept asking me multiple times why I didn't want to stay in his house, and kept pushing that I should stay in his house because, they had Chinese food, they had a bedroom for me, things like that. But it just really bothered me that I brought up concerns about, not feeling like comfortable around him saying like sexually inappropriate things, and then he still wanted to push like that I should stay in his house. I just couldn't understand like why that was something that was going through his head. Um, he also would send me messages saying that he was thinking about me late at night, completely unprompted. And this started building up as the trip started getting closer. Um, and there's just something that like I just kept coming back to. Like I said, one reason I wanted to go on this trip is because I'm basically the same age as Brian's daughters. And I want to be like clear why I'm saying that. I'm not suggesting that I'm a child. I'm an adult. I was 28 when this all happened. There's lots of adoptees that are also adults. It's more so the role that Brian occupied. Brian is the adoptive father of daughters from China. He spent decades working with other adoptees, presenting himself as someone adoptees and adoptive families can trust with incredibly sensitive parts of their lives. And I came to him through that like same kind of expectation. It's not like I met him on a dating app. I didn't meet this man in a bar. I didn't like approach him because I wanted some kind of other relationship. We met because I reached out to him about searching for my birth family. And from what Brian has shared with me, he was born in 1960. I was born in 1997. That's about a 37-year age difference between us. He would have also been approximately 40 or 54 to 55 when I was turning 18. I don't really understand why any of those comments would ever be perceived as a joke or funny, about wanting to see me in the shower or wanting to give me massages underneath my clothes and things like that. Yeah, maybe I'm missing something, but no part of that was funny to me. Um, and like I said, I just thought the trip was set up under a different circumstance. So later, whenever things started to change and things started to get sexual and uncomfortable and things started to be, pushed repeatedly, I just couldn't separate the comments from the position of trust that he was supposed to occupy, like in my mind. And when I confronted these comments directly, his response was not that I misunderstood him. He acknowledged that he meant what he said. He just essentially said he shouldn't have said it out loud. He said he wanted to see me in the shower. Um, yeah, and this is something I confronted him at the time on November 1st, 2025. I sent him a written email ending our collaboration, saying that I would not be flying out to Utah to work on the project. I identified the specific things that upset me. I canceled the trip. I asked that he not communicate with me anymore. Um, yeah, and I thought that would be the end of it. But then he reached out to me again, and it felt like he was trying to honestly rewrite the script, and was asking me again for kind of like a follow-up question to the birth parent analysis, saying like, hey, can you send me your paperwork? Did I ever get that done for you? Even though he had already told the adoptive parent that I had the analysis, and he knew I didn't have it, and told just misrepresented what had happened. And that was really frustrating because it felt like, my reality was now trying to be written over by creating this, different email documentation trail. So in December 2025, I put together a written response, just with the chronological like stuff that happened, supporting documentation, and that's something that I'm gonna show at the end of this video as well. And that's something like one of the reasons why I can show you this stuff today. I'm not relying on my memory. I documented my concerns as they are happening, and I think that matters. I also want to acknowledge, for fairness, I know Brian has helped people, and I know DNAConnect has done some successful things. And I have heard that there are adoptees and families who are genuinely grateful for the work that DNAConnect has done, and I'm not trying to erase that. What I am trying to say is that positives don't overwrite, bad behavior. Two things can be true at once. Somebody can do meaningful work and still behave in ways that deserve scrutiny. Helping one person does not erase inappropriate behavior towards another person. Success does not create an exemption from accountability. And I do not believe respect should depend on how useful someone is to an organization, how successful their search is, how connected they are, how long they've been part of the community, or how much someone believes they owe that person. Every adoptee deserves the same basic respect. Every adoptee deserves appropriate boundaries. Um, and every adoptee deserves honesty, and to be treated worthy of consideration. In fact, I think if you do this kind of work, with, this kind of community, that creates more of a responsibility rather than less. The more people that trust you, the more access you have, and the more authority you have. So it's the more important that you use that position to act responsibly. Um, when I wrote to Brian in December, I explicitly acknowledged that he had done meaningful work for this community and said that it made it all the more important to model integrity, transparency, and respect. This is why I come back to informed consent, because I'm not making this video because I believe every person has to reach the same conclusion I did. I'm not telling everyone they were required to stop working with Brian or DNAConnect. If someone sees this information and decides they're still comfortable working with them, then that is obviously 100% their decision, but it should be an informed decision. Adoptees should be able to decide who they trust with their DNA. They should be able to decide who they trust with their information about their biological families. They should be able to decide who they travel with, whose homes they stay in, and who they allow into some of the most personal and vulnerable parts of their lives. And you cannot make fully informed decision if relevant information is hidden from you. Being well known does not automatically make someone safe. Being featured in the news does not automatically make someone safe. Running an organization does not automatically make someone safe. Having successful searches does not automatically make someone safe. And having helped many people does not mean the experience of one person who is treated inappropriately matters less. One of the biggest things I've learned over the last year is that birth family searching can require adoptees to place an extraordinary amount of trust in people we barely know. Searchers might have access to our DNA. They might have access to our private records. They know information about our biological families that we don't. They might have contacts in China or control or manage DNA kits or understand systems we only are starting to navigate. And that kind of access creates responsibility. So when you're deciding who to work with, I encourage you to ask your questions. Who has access to your DNA? Who controls your kits? Who sees your personal information? Are professional and personal relationships being kept separate? Are you being asked to keep things secret? Does someone make you feel like access to information or opportunities depends on maintaining a particular relationship with them? And what happens when you try to establish a boundary? How do they respond when you say something made you feel uncomfortable? Keep your communications, document important conversations, and talk to other adoptees. And remember that receiving help from someone does not mean you owe them secrecy, loyalty, or access to you personally. I'm sharing this because I wish I had understood those things better when I started searching. I cannot make anyone else's decision about Brian or DNAConnect for them. I can acknowledge the people he has helped. I can acknowledge that some searches have been successful, but I can also tell the truth about what's happened to me. Those things are not mutually exclusive. What I can do is make sure that my own documented experience is available to those who are deciding that who they want to trust with their search. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. Okay, like I said, I'm gonna have a link with a folder where people can look at that because they know some of it was a little hard to see. I'm also completely willing to let, or jump on a call with like moderators or anything like that if there's anything they want to verify. But like I said, the reason I put the redacted versions here is because I don't want to inadvertently expose other people's DNA because there were a lot of times we were talking about specific, DNA kits that included adoptees and other people, that haven't consented to be like in this video. So thank you.